Welcome back to the channel. Well, I have to admit, I've been a skeptic about force feedback yokes. The ones I've tried in the past just didn't measure up. They felt a bit artificial, and they were expensive. If nothing else, my 23,000 plus flying hours in real life has taught me what it feels like to fly a real airplane. 5 or 6 years ago at FS Weekend in the Netherlands, I got a chance to try the Flight Illusions force feedback yoke. And I felt like I was arm wrestling with that thing. More recently, a good friend has a early Brunner yoke, and I have to admit it was much better, but there were certain times when it would kind of release the pressure in an unnatural way. It just didn't feel quite right. The result of all this is that I just kind of wrote these things off and decided that a force feedback yoke just wasn't for me. So when I was contacted by FlightSim.com, a company based in Singapore, with the offer to get my hands on one of their prototypes of their new force feedback yoke and give it a review, I reluctantly said yes. Stick around for the rest of the video and I'll tell you what changed my mind and how this might be a unique opportunity to add realism to your flight simming experience. The yoke arrived from Singapore, great condition, well packed, included the yoke, power adapter and power cord, an emergency shutoff, and USB-C to A connectors. What struck me when I first opened the unit was its sturdy metal construction and its size. I'll post the dimensions here in case you want to pause and take a good look at them. Full-size Cessna yoke is quite impressive. A look inside helps explain the size, as it needs to accommodate the powerful servo motors that drive the yoke with a maximum force of 60 newtons or about 13.5 pounds. In my sim, the yoke was too wide to mount on the pedestal I had, so I had to mount a board on there. And you can see that the ears that stick out from the case have holes for mounting. I just used wood screws. If you wanted a more temporary solution, you could use C-clamps on those forward ears on each side of the case. The horn has the standard buttons: trim, autopilot disconnect, push to talk, and on the opposite side, a spare button and a hat switch. The first time you release the emergency stop button by twisting and allowing it to pop up, this thing will get your attention as it goes into its self-test mode. The yoke has a massive 165 millimeter or 6.5 inch travel, 90 degrees left and right rotation, and it runs through the entire range during the test. Best to keep your hands and fingers out of the way until you're sure it's done. Does a little wiggle right at the end. There. So why would we even want to have a force feedback yoke? Well, as a pilot, I'm always thinking about training value. Using a standard spring or bungee loaded simulation yoke means that we always have the same pitch and roll forces no matter what aircraft we are flying. This yoke allows us to create different control loading profiles both for pitch and roll for various aircraft to make them more realistic, like the forces in the real aircraft. A rule of thumb is that an aircraft's controls are considered harmonized if they adhere to the 1-2-4 rule. This means that if the roll or aileron max force is 1, the pitch force max should be double that, and the max rudder force should be 4 times that. The force feedback tool software that comes with the yoke allows you to set the profiles for the pitch and the roll exactly as you'd like them. This creates a lot of positive training transfer to the real aircraft. Besides the Cessna 172 force profile, which is default on the yoke, I tried several other aircraft, including these. It's possible to set the force on the yoke up to 60 newtons. That's about 13.5 pounds. For the smaller aircraft like the Cessna 150, I used 10 newtons, or about 2.25 pounds, and I varied it up to 60 newtons, the max force, for some of the heavies. With a spring-loaded yoke, you're pretty much limited to that single force profile, so the yoke's going to either be too light for a heavy aircraft or too heavy for a light aircraft. Being able to set the force closer to the real-life aircraft really enhances the realism, and I understand there's going to be an upgrade for this yoke to take it up to 120 newtons in the future. Transport aircraft have historically had heavy stick forces, and that makes you fly the aircraft a little smoother. Even though the flight dynamics can be made right by the modeler, if you try to fly a heavy aircraft with a very light stick force, as most spring-loaded yokes are, it's very hard to fly the aircraft smoothly. The yoke was also very smooth. I didn't feel it fighting me at all, any time. I'm not going to share with you the software for setting up the force profiles in this video. While the software that I was provided worked great, it could have been more user-friendly, and they're in the process of refining that and simplifying the interface. So besides realistic stick forces, you can also learn to trim as you would in the real aircraft using this force feedback yoke. Let me explain. In any steady state condition of flight, like level flight, we say the aircraft is trimmed in pitch when the elevator is at the unique position that causes the nose to neither rise or fall. With a more conventional spring-based simulator yoke, the goal is to trim the aircraft so that the forces can be released on the yoke with the springs pulling evenly in a neutral position. If we slow the aircraft and purposely do not trim, it takes considerable force to oppose the spring to hold the elevator in the correct position for level flight. Then, as we begin to trim the aircraft, we have to continually reduce the force and allow the yoke to continue to move back in toward its neutral position. The end result is the yoke back in the neutral position and the aircraft trimmed for level flight. While this is close to the way a real aircraft is trimmed, let's look at how force feedback yokes can improve on this. So now we're back at level flight with a force feedback yoke like the CLS-60. Just like with the spring yoke, if the aircraft is trimmed, there's no pitch force required on the yoke. Again, if we slow without trimming, it will require significant force to hold the elevator in the position to maintain level flight. Since the elevator is mechanically linked to the yoke in a real aircraft, usually by cables, as we trim the aircraft, the yoke will not move. The trim tab will reduce the forces on the elevator, allowing us to release pressure from the yoke. While the end result is a yoke with no force in a trimmed aircraft, the way trimming occurs is a little different. So let's have a little demo and see how this works using the TBM 850 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Going to trim it up at about 200 knots or so. Make sure it's trimmed up, hands off, looks good. Fairly level, and we're going to slow up. And as we slow, I'm going to purposely try to not trim. You can see the yoke moving aft. The pitch is increasing to maintain level flight. Continue to watch that yoke as it moves aft. I'm going to speed this up a bit. Instead of releasing pressure on the yoke and allowing it to move forward, now we're just holding the yoke in approximately the same place, trimming and allowing the pressure to relieve, and we can just feel the yoke get lighter and lighter in our hand without moving it. Back to real speed. So the force feedback yoke simulates that connection between the yoke and the elevator and allows it to stay in the same position for any specific elevator position. Results in a much more natural trimming. So now that we're at about 110 knots and it's trimmed, the yoke hasn't really moved in at all. And we'll just get it trimmed up and release it and show that it is trimmed up for level flight. Well, if this was all the CLS-60 could do, I would think it was still worth it for the price. But there are a lot more things it can do that really enhance the simulation experience, and they're kind of fun. For example, on recip aircraft, you can set the yoke handle to vibrate in accordance with the RPM. And when you increase the RPM, it smooths out. Another effect we see is the effect of the prop wash blowing on the elevator, which can cause an elevator that's hanging down to rise up as it is blown by the slipstream. Watch how the elevator rises and the stick moves back as power is added. Of course, all these effects are optional and can be discontinued depending on the type of aircraft. Another effect that can be simulated is the effect of the airflow over the aircraft as it begins its takeoff roll. Watch the aft movement of the yoke as it begins to accelerate down the runway. I've disabled the prop wash effect so you can see the pure effect of the aerodynamics over the tail, much as you would with a jet. And for bigger jets that are hydraulically controlled and not subject to elevator drooping at 0 speed, you can disable all these effects. The yoke also has effects for stalls. The yoke can simulate a buffet as you approach the stall. It's a low-frequency rumble you feel in your hand. It can also imitate a stick shaker if the aircraft is so equipped. During the ground roll, you can also get tactile feedback based on the smoothness of the surface and your speed. As the elevator begins to bounce in response to the bumps on the runway, the yoke moves slightly fore and aft. As the speed increases, the frequency of the motion increases very realistically. Finally, at takeoff speed, when we lift off, the effect ceases. The yoke can also simulate the effects of turbulence as you're flying in rough air. Another cool effect is a little bump that you feel in the yoke as you touch down based on your sink rate at the time of touchdown. Now watch the yoke closely as I release it before touchdown and watch the movement. Now in case you missed that, let's try that again with a little firmer landing, a little steeper approach this time, and again I'll let go and watch the yoke. Quite a bump there, and quite a bad landing I might add. Let's try one more. This time let's try to make a good landing. I feel just a very gentle bump, and if you grease it on completely, you won't get any feedback. So stick around and I'll give you my overall impressions of the CLS-60 yoke from flightsim.com. So physically, the yoke is quite impressive. All metal construction seems to be very well made. And while the case is much larger than I would like, the very long shaft on the yoke will allow it to be hidden behind an instrument panel for cockpit builders. The large full-size Cessna-style yoke is sturdy and has all the basic buttons. The yoke can be removed, and I understand they will be offering alternative yokes that can be quickly mounted on to change the look and feel of your sim. In the 2 weeks I've had this yoke, I've flown a wide variety of aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator and X-Plane, and it also supports Lockheed Prepared. Drawing on my many years of experience flying real aircraft, I feel this yoke has a very realistic feel. I would describe it as smooth. It has no mechanical feel as I've experienced with other feedback yokes I've tried. The ability to assign custom roll and pitch forces to each aircraft really enhances the flight simming realism. And as I've mentioned before, being able to trim the sim like a real aircraft is a big deal in my opinion. The many cool effects are just icing on the cake, and I'm sure many more will be added. I know they are about to release an upgrade that will allow the autopilot controls to move the flight controls realistically during flight. Another feature I didn't mention was the ability to hook two of these yokes together using an Ethernet cable and have them operate in unison as though they were physically connected dual flight controls. Considering this is being launched as a Kickstarter, I feel the hardware is quite mature. I think their main need is to gain capital to finance production of the yoke. So while I have a very positive view of this yoke after spending some time with it, there are some areas for improvement that I'd like to share. First, currently, all trimming has to take place with the yoke-mounted trim switch. The yoke does not respond to trim inputs from the simulator or third-party trim wheels. The Brunner force feedback yoke does not have this limitation, so I feel certain it could be overcome, likely with software upgrades. Second, the software that's used to set up the yoke is a bit cumbersome. It definitely needs a new graphical user interface. They've promised to do that, but it definitely needs to take place to make the use of the yoke simpler. And in that vein, just a word of caution. Adding this yoke does add a layer of complexity to your simulator. One more thing to turn on, one more thing to set, one more thing to maintain. But if your goal is simulation realism and you're willing to pay that small price, it's well worth it. I'm going to be using this yoke on a daily basis from now on. It's going to be tough to go back to a spring-loaded yoke. The CLS-60 is going to be offered as a Kickstarter for $799, which in my opinion is a very good price for this capable hardware. I'm sure you can find out more about the Kickstarter program for the CLS-60 at their website at flightsim.com. They also have an active Discord channel at that same name. I will remind you that in a Kickstarter program, you're supporting the company's effort to develop the product, and the hardware is offered as a reward for your support and not necessarily guaranteed that it will be delivered. Although in this case, I think the risk is low because the development is so far along. I think for many out there, the small risk will be outweighed by the very good price for this yoke. Well, if you've hung into the end, thanks for watching the whole video. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends. I'd love to have your comments, especially on this yoke. And if you have further questions about the yoke, feel free to ask those questions in the comments, and I'll try to respond. And one more thing I should have said up front. This yoke was provided to me by flightsim.com for free to use and review. I had no restrictions on anything I might say about it. This is my honest opinion. It may only be worth what you paid for it. Hope to see you again on my next video.